The sermon text comes from the 12th chapter of the book of Romans. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. No, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. They are thirsty, give them something to eat, for by doing this you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a Zulu word that means I am, because we are. An African philosophy that was developed into a theology by the Archbishop of South Africa, the Anglican Archbishop of South Africa, Desmond Tutu. Ubuntu is a belief in the interconnectedness of all humanity. The theology believes that because we are all made in the image of God, and because we are all children of God, what happens to one affects and impacts the other. The belief is that as we share and understand and care about the other person, what happens to them affects us. We are drawn together by a shared humanity. Desmond Tutu used this idea of theology of Ubuntu as he chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. The country was divided. There were people who had been set up in a class or caste system. A lot of violence and horrible things had happened. There were many civil and human rights abuses. And the country was trying to figure out how to rise above all of this destruction as a people so that they could live and work together after all of the anger and animus caused because of the horrors and the sin of apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that their purpose was to have people come to the court and first of all get to the truth of what happened. It's important following a tragedy or something horrible to get to the bottom of it, like lancing the wound so that people knew and talked about the horrible atrocities that occurred. And then in the process of getting to the truth, trying to find a way to reconcile people so that they could live together, rather than retribution so that people are continually at odds, a way to be and to live peaceably with all. And so people came to the commission, and those who had crimes committed against them told their stories, and those who were seeking amnesty for their actions also shared their stories. But they had to listen to each other. They had to hear and see the humanity in the other, because what happens so often in a situation like apartheid or any kind of division like that is that a person who is different than us becomes the other, the enemy, the one in whom we are locked in combat. And so the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Ubuntu, to see that interconnectedness. And that's what Paul is getting at in the text from Romans that we have today too. How do we see each other and connect with one another? How do we deal with people with whom we are in conflict? How do we live together in community? How do we live in the spirit of Ubuntu? Paul was writing to the people of Rome, where there were Gentiles and Jews who had been locked in conflict. And he is saying, you are all Christians. And he spends the whole first part of the book saying, you are saved not because you're Jewish or because you were Gentile, but because Christ saved you. All have sinned and you are drawn into one through the grace of Christ. And then in chapter 12, the text I spoke about last week and this one, it talks about then how we are to live once we have been saved by grace. The gospel text today talks about taking up your cross. And this text is talking about what it means to take up the cross and live in relationship with Jesus Christ. To take on the burden of Christianity and walk with Christ as we live with one another. And the key to that is to see a shared humanity. The Human Genome Project did a mapping of the human genome, and what they discovered is that 99.9% of all humans share basically the same genetic makeup. But how much time and energy do we devote to that 0.1%? That percent that differentiates us, and how much damage has it caused our society? Where people are victimized because of the color of their skin or the language they speak. What kinds of struggles that we have because of 0.1% of who we are that differentiates us. And we are called to see in each other a shared humanity. To see and find and live peaceably with all. And what that means is that what happens to someone else impacts and should hurt us in the same way. So when we hear of a child who is a refugee in Uganda, who's born in a camp, whose mother gives birth on a dirt floor and has nothing to feed them because they've been isolated and because they live in a place where they've fled violence and they've come to a place where they don't feel welcomed. We need to care about that. Just like we need to care about what's happening in California with the fires and the hurricanes on the Gulf Coast. Just like we need to care about what's happening with the racial unrest in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We are interconnected, and we cannot turn off the news and turn off the world and act like it doesn't impact us, because if we are followers of Christ, we are called to take up the cross and care about what happens to others. But we're also called to live out the grace of God in our lives as we relate to one another. And how do we do that? Because what I'm going to do here today in Hartford, Connecticut is not going to impact what happens in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or in California, or in Uganda. But I believe that the ripple effect occurs when we care and when we relate to one another and when we heed the words that Paul wrote in this text. You know, when I first read it, I thought, well, you know, maybe for the sermon, I'll just read this over and over and over again, because what can I add to it? It is exactly the method in which we can engage in life and find peace. Desmond Tutu, when he talks about Ubuntu theology, tells us that the idea behind it is that when we are in relationship with others and care about them and recognize the interconnected, we do feel better. You know, when you're angry and you're upset and you're divided against yourself or you're divided against another person, your heart beats harder, your stomach hurts, your blood pressure raises, and you don't feel as good about things. But when we seek to live in relationship with each other, when we recognize that interconnectedness, and when we see that we're called to live peaceably with all, we're going to feel a whole lot better. This is a recipe for how to get through life in a way that elevates us and makes us happier. It's kind of like the 10 Commandments. God puts them in place for rules for living in community, but God also knows that we're going to be happier and healthier when we live in relationship with others, when we don't want what somebody else has, when we don't steal, when we honor the relationships we're in, when we promote life, when we care for those who are elders and care for them, when we take time to rest, and when we recognize that God is God and we are not. That's what this text from Romans is telling us, that this is a guide to a happier life, not in order to be redeemed by God, but a path to live a generally much more content life. It's like when my kids were little. They wanted to put a fork in the outlet, and I said, "You can't put a fork in the outlet." Was that because I was trying to cause them pain or difficulty? No. It's because I loved my children, and I wanted to protect them, and I knew they'd be happier if they didn't stick the fork in the outlet. Well, this text is telling us not to stick a fork in the outlet, to care for others, to rejoice with those who rejoice, to not think more highly of ourselves with others, and to not get hung up in vengeance, to build up and promote peace. And how we do that begins locally. If you're angry with a neighbor or a friend or someone in the church community, let go of it. Let go and let God. Live peaceably. Don't hold on to it. Don't respond evil for evil, but respond evil for good, because you will feel better. Remember times in my life where people have done things that have not been kind to me. And when I responded in kind, I was less than myself. But when I rose above it and treated them with dignity and respect, I didn't have to deal with it. They could struggle with how they responded, but they didn't let them get to me, because I found I was happier and more content. This text tells us that when we see the humanity in the other person, and when we focus on that, we find Ubuntu. We find a sense that rises us rather than it's just me. John Donne said, "No man is an island." He was right. We are interconnected, and we need to care for one another. We need to love one another. We need to rise above the division of the society, and we need to see that we are united in the love of Christ. And as followers of Christ, we take up the cross of Christ by caring. So don't turn off the news or care less about what's happening in the world, but turn it on with the love of Christ and see how you can reach out to a neighbor or a friend or someone within your family or community, maybe someone with whom you've had struggle or strife. Let go of it. Recognize that love is meant to be sincere. And when we love, when we care for one another, we find Ubuntu. We find community. And when we find community, we find peace. For Christ made communion with us, as fallen and broken as we are, and calls us to care for others, as we are all in the image of God. Ubuntu. Amen.